So by really the mid-20th century in the US and then spreading around the world, and especially spreading around the world in the post-Cold War era, the objectivity norm has become pretty widely accepted, pretty widespread. Around the world, journalists are trying, or at least claiming, to be objective, and audiences increasingly have an expectation of objectivity. But whenever you have a goal, and I think this is a pretty iron law of the social world, really whenever you set out some goal or some objective, some ideal to attain, people tend to work toward really more toward the indicators and the proxy measures of that goal, and often not toward the substantive goal itself, if that makes sense. So, you have, as a society, a goal of, let's say, improving citizen welfare. And so you develop some proxy measures of welfare, like GDP per capita, like unemployment rates. What inevitably happens is that policymakers start kind of gaming the system, or gaming that goal. They start adopting measures that raise the GDP and lower employment rates, even without actually improving the lives of citizens, because what they get evaluated on is the indicator. Their performance on the visible proxy measure is what they get evaluated for, and not so much achieving the substantive but less visible or more difficult to measure goal of like actually improving people's lives. And in journalism, a lot of critics have argued that the same kind of thing has happened to objectivity as a goal. It's difficult to measure how substantively objective a journalist is being, according to Lippmann's definition of objectivity. And actually, it's probably impossible to evaluate that without becoming an expert in every single one of the issues that they're reporting on. And so instead, what we do, we newsreaders, we colleagues of those journalists, what we do is we look for indicators. We look for signals that they're objective, that kind of are more easily visible, easier to discern than really getting down to the nitty-gritty of, in this story, they reported these facts, but is there countervailing evidence that would contradict it? It's tough to do that for every story that a journalist writes. So instead, every story that a news outlet publishes. So instead, you look at, indicators, at proxy measures. So, for example, the style of a journalist's writing, whether they express overt subjective opinions, whether they include information supporting more than one side of an issue, like people who disagree with each other. These tend to get used as kind of indicators, as proxy measures of objectivity that appear in the texts themselves that journalists produce. And then because those indicators are what they're actually being evaluated on, both by the public and by their colleagues in the world of news media, what journalists tend to do is inevitably they tend to work towards satisfying those indicators, toward meeting those indicators of, am I writing in the right style? Am I ticking boxes of news balance? They tend to work toward those indicators rather than the goal that's much more difficult to achieve and they don't, get as much credit for anyway, the substantive goal of creating more objective representations of the world. So objectivity becomes not a method for processing information in order to produce a more accurate representation of the world, but instead what happens is journalists kind of morphs into a performance that journalists put on, a ritual that signals their membership in their professional community, that signals their legitimacy to the public. This second view of objectivity as a performative discourse is central to Marcel Broersma's 2010 article, The Unbearable Limitations of Journalism, on press critique and journalism's claim to truth. Broersma argues that substantive objectivity is ultimately impossible because our perceptions of the world are socially constructed. And we've come across social constructionism before with Stuart Hall and with James Carey. And this should be kind of getting to be a familiar line of argumentation by now. So Broersma says there's a real world out there, yes, but the process of making sense of that world, of focusing on some aspects of the world as important while ignoring others, that is, our representations of the world, are always rooted in our cultures and our struggles for power and so on, and so they're always subjective. There's no one accurate, objective representation of an event, of a phenomena, of whatever. There's no one objective representation from which inaccurate, subjective representations diverge. So this is a different view than Lippmann has, right? Broersma is more skeptical of the idea that there is even such a thing as a more objective representation of the world. And so Broersma wants to kind of change the conversation away from lamenting why journalists aren't acting more substantively objectively, to instead asking why journalists claim to be objective, and asking how they manage to convince anybody that they're objective if objectivity is actually impossible. So he kind of wants to change the conversation away from substantive, capital O objectivity, and instead talk about objectivity in scare quotes, right? Objectivity as something that is performed and signaled, not because it actually provides us with access to raw truths of the world, but because a performance of objectivity can be a useful tool in a journalist's cultural toolkit that allows them to convince readers that their ideas are valid, that allows them to attain high status in the field of journalism, allows them to avoid flack, right, from angry politicians or business people or whatever. And whether we side with Broersma here and think that the social construction of reality means that substantive objectivity is just a myth, or whether we side with Lippmann and think that some representations of the world are actually more objective and accurate than others, either way, whichever side we take, I think it is worth thinking about objectivity as a performative discourse. It's worth thinking about how journalists convince audiences and convince each other and themselves that they're reporting objectively and telling factual truths. And Broersma says that the way that journalists convince people that they're objective and truth is really much more a matter of style than it is a matter of substance. He writes, quote, "In most cases, events are multi-interpretable and not verifiable by the public or even the journalists. Readers are not able to determine whether the contents of an article are true. The average reader or viewer does not know anything about events in, for example, the Middle East, but she or he still considers news items true if they are published in a well-known newspaper and adhere to professional routines and familiar textual conventions. And the facts seem plausible because they refer to existing public knowledge and cultural codes. So journalism does not derive its performative power from its contents, the facts, but merely from its forms and style." Some of the elements of the quote-unquote objective style of journalism have to do with the routines for how articles are written or how broadcasts are read, right? So reporters tend to avoid writing in the first person. They don't use words like I, me, my in this objective style of journalism, and instead they write in a kind of depersonalized, generic style. They write in a way that seems to stick just to the facts and to not offer an overt opinion, even though, of course, right, our opinions, our subjectivity shape which facts we select and how we present those facts. And that's a performative style, this kind of dry, neutral, voice from nowhere style, where you don't hear the I pronoun used, is something that you do see really all over the place. And especially, for example, if you read reports from wire agencies like the Associated Press or Reuters or Agence France Presse, And I think those agencies especially have a commitment. They really want to be seen as objective and as nonpartisan, because their whole business model is that news outlets across the political spectrum and around the world subscribe to their services, to the news wires, to get the latest information. And so they want to convince their colleagues, as much as their readers, the end readers of the news, that they are not inserting their own subjectivity. And they do that through these textual conventions, Broersma says. Broersma writes that another element of journalists' performances of objectivity has to do with sourcing. Journalists kind of provide cover for themselves against accusations of subjectivity by quoting people and documents that are generally seen as reliable, and they often note how they're checking their facts, how they've checked their facts, how they try to reach out to all relevant parties, even those who didn't respond to their inquiries. So Broersma writes, quote, journalists quote documents from what they describe as reliable sources and quote various individuals, preferably people who are personally involved, experts, and eyewitnesses. Information is attributed to these sources, which makes the facts verifiable and more reliable, especially if explicit references are made to the reliability of the sources and they are checked. Quotes from people with differing views in an article gives the impression that all the sides were heard and the reporting is balanced. And there are a couple notes to be made here. So the first thing is about what's considered reliable sources and reliable information. And it's questionable. Are things that are publicly seen as reliable, is that because they actually are more likely to correspond to reality? Or is it because, as Marx would argue, what's seen as quote unquote reliable is the information that's produced by the ruling class, the ruling elite, through the institutions that they've captured, like the government and educational system and things like this. Also, it's important to recognize that this idea of journalistic balance, right, of quoting people from different sides so it looks as if you've exhausted all perspectives. This idea of journalistic balance, which you sometimes hear equated with objectivity, is actually different in an important way than the substantive objectivity that Lippmann was talking about. Lippmann did think that, so absolutely, if you're a reporter and you favor one side in some debate, in some debate or some controversy, you shouldn't just talk to people who agree with you. You should check your own bias, and you should look for information from the other side that might make you rethink your assumptions. But Lippmann did not say that in actually presenting the news, journalists should just refuse to say which side in the debate is being more honest, and should just stick to recording the claims of different sides. They shouldn't just, it's not enough, it's not objective reporting to just say, look, hey, these Democrats I interviewed say there wasn't electoral fraud, but these Republicans I interviewed said there was. That kind of balance, which media critics sometimes call both sidesism, which again is a bit more like the mechanical objectivity of the scientist who kind of refused to correct his microscope's optical distortion. That kind of balance actually really kind of goes completely against the spirit of Lippmann's substantive objectivity, because the journalist is abdicating their responsibility to actually get to the truth based on the facts, and regardless of what the majority of people think, or regardless of what each of the different sides in a debate thinks. And after all, in most debates, reality is not like equally distributed between the disagreeing sides. Often one side is more right and the other is more wrong. And if you're, a political partisan, let's say, engaging with journalists who adhere to this kind of communication ritual, this kind of ritual of mechanical balance, it's also, of course, incredibly easy to game the system, to get journalists to repeat whatever falsehoods you spew, because they'll do that anyway in the name of balance, and it doesn't really incentivize telling the truth if you are a partisan, and you can reliably have journalists just say, well, this side says this. And this has been a strategy of lots of political and economic factions trying to sway public opinions. is that just, if you're doing something bad, if you're actually doing something bad, you just, first of all, deny it. And second of all, you point your finger at your opponents and then make false claims that they're actually the ones doing something bad. And so if journalists stick to this both sidesism, then public audiences just hear, okay, there are these two competing sets of claims out there, and then it's either, it's like a buffet and you just pick whichever you feel like believing in. Or what may happen is that subjected to relentless both sidesism, people just kind of end up doubting everything and becoming apathetic, right? Thinking, well, I guess all leaders are corrupt, all economic systems are broken, and so who cares about the truth of this one scandal, and how could we ever know it and get to the bottom of it? So refusing to take sides by balancing competing claims and by signaling political neutrality is a pretty lousy way of achieving substantive objectivity. And so what Broersma's argument is if we want to know why journalists continue to do this, continue to adopt this kind of mechanical balance, we're better off thinking of balance as a performance strategy.
Hi, my name is Carl Azus. I host and write a 10-minute news show called CNN 10.
Hi Carl, how's it going? My name is Terrell Wright and I'm from Atlanta. My question to you is, how can teams make sure that they're reporting objectively and to present all sides of the story? Thanks.
If your goal is to stay neutral on controversial topics, there are two things you got to keep in mind: balance and weight. Think of it like lifting a pair of dumbbells. If you want a balanced workout, you need them to weigh the same. On CNN 10, we want to keep our coverage like our diet, balanced. But back in my day as a writer, which I was before I was on camera, I was given an incredibly valuable lesson by an executive. She said, don't just balance every controversy. Make sure the different sides are weighted the same. For instance, let's say you're doing a crucial undercover expose on the breed of dog that makes its owners happiest. If you devote 1.5 minutes to Chihuahuas, extolling all the big benefits of the smallest dogs, and then you spend 15 seconds saying that Great Dane owners are howling in protest, you might say the story is balanced. After all, it has more than one perspective, but it's not weighted the same, dog. You've given 90 seconds to one position and 15 to the other. You've given one argument a leg up, so to speak, on the other. So to cover something objectively, you'll want to try to give the opposing sides equal time, or at least cover their opposing points equally.
If journalists quote both sides and refuse to adjudicate who's telling the truth and who's lying, it makes sense, not epistemologically, not as an objective method, a la Walter Lippmann. But what it does mean is that they're a lot less likely to face flack from the different factions involved in those controversies. They're a lot less likely also to alienate readers who have their own subjective biases. So, there's a paradox here, which is that the best way to convince people that you're being objective may actually violate the central principles of objective or of substantive objectivity that Lippmann advocated a century ago. And the same problem, the problem that kind of a performance of objectivity can go against substantive objectivity, I think that same pattern holds true when we think about the way that journalists frame stories. And as a reminder, when we talk about framing, we're talking about the perspective from which news is told, which necessarily includes some information while excluding others, always presents particular information as part of some larger story, some larger context, while excluding other potential contexts and narratives. All stories necessarily have to be framed in some way. And Broersma writes, quote, "To be persuasive and attractive, news items also have to fit into the mind frames in the general public. In order to appeal to the cultural codes and existing public knowledge, news and information are framed by the media. In an effort to attribute meaning to something that is unfamiliar to people, you have to relate it to something they know. Frames are, quote, organizing principles that are socially shared and persistent over time that work symbolically to meaningfully structure the social world. They organize and simplify complex events and issues in order to make sense of them." End quote. So this is another paradox. in order to be accepted as objective, a report should fit within pre-existing frames, pre-existing narratives and worldviews of its viewers, which are, of course, themselves subjective, right? These worldviews of their viewers are subjective, culturally produced, socially constructed. We as news consumers are more likely to accept the factuality and objectivity of a report if it does not challenge our prejudices. And you might remember this is central to the idea of coherence theory, the coherence theory of truth that I previously discussed. And as we've also seen in the literature on gatekeeping, we're more likely to second guess a news report if it does challenge our pre-existing assumptions. But again, challenging prejudices and assumptions is precisely what Lippmann said objective methods of inquiry are supposed to do. So there's a paradox of framing something in a way that people accept as objective is kind of surrendering to their subjective biases. The question of framing also comes up in anthropologist Mark Pedelty's ethnographic study of foreign correspondents covering El Salvador's civil war in the late 1980s and early 90s. Following a similar line of argumentation to Broersma, Pedelty argues that the way these correspondents he studied are able to prop up the fiction, really, that they're engaged in objective journalism, the way that they're able to claim that they can completely set aside any of their own objectivity is by strategically framing their stories in ways that avoid challenging readers' expectations and pre-existing values. That is, the readers being both, the end public and also their editors and their colleagues in the foreign press corps in El Salvador. Pedelty writes, quote, "While the rules of objective journalism prohibit reporters from making subjective interpretations, their task demands it. A fact, itself a cultural construct, can only be communicated through placement in a system of meaning shared by reporter and reader. Journalists cannot resolve this contradiction between professional myth and practice, only manage it through judicious use of news frames. Frames are, quote, persistent patterns of cognition, interpretation, and presentation, of selection, emphasis, and exclusion by which symbol handlers routinely organize discourse, whether verbal or visual." And he's quoting sociologist Todd Gitlin there. Mainstream journalists tend to adopt frames whose logic is drawn from the most penetrant and unquestioned cultural values, myths, and ideologies, perspectives least likely to be challenged or perhaps even identified by audience and journalist. News frames that contain our most deeply held cultural subjectivities will therefore appear natural expositions of reality, common sense portrayals rather than constructed interpretive frameworks. In other words, the objective reality of news is formed of our most fundamental and intractable subjectivities, what Herbert Gantz calls enduring values. Taking a critical view of these values, or at least the media manipulation thereof, Michael Parenti writes, quote, "The worst forms of tyranny, or certainly the most successful ones, are not those we rail against, but those that so insinuate themselves into the imagery of our consciousness and the fabric of our lives as to not be perceived as tyranny." In Pedelty's telling, there's a kind of subtle tyranny at play here in the way that journalists in El Salvador report, or at least the American ones. The story is actually a bit different from those reporting for European news outlets, who actually don't seem to have quite the same commitment or the same hang-up about performing objectivity. At least in Pedelty's account. But the American journalists, or rather the journalists reporting for American news organizations, tend to toe the line of, well, basically toe the line of the U.S. government, which is, at the time, which was supporting a right-wing military junta fighting against leftist rebels. So these journalists tend to, play down government human rights violations, the horrible economic inequality that's propping up El Salvador's military allied oligarchy. And also they tend to play down the role of the United States as an important part of the context for the Civil War. And these American journalists in El Salvador are influenced by a lot of the same factors that I've gone over previously when discussing gatekeeping theory and Herman and Chomsky's book Manufacturing Consent. Like, for example, like reliance on official government sources. Pedelty describes this in much more detail. I won't get into too much his arguments. But what I like about Pedelty's argument here, and what I want to highlight, is that in his thinking, the performers of objectivity, the quote unquote objective journalists, who he says actually have a deeply pro-U.S. government bias, these journalists aren't necessarily like cynically duping their audiences. They're not even necessarily aware that they're putting on a performance. They think that they're following a professional and moral code of substantive objectivity. They're just not kind of questioning the consensus definition of objectivity. Pedelty argues that journalists' adherence to objectivity is a problem. That the way that they value objective reporting and reward quote-unquote objective colleagues with high status, he thinks this is a problem because these journalists have internalized a definition of objectivity that was basically determined in such a way as to serve the ruling elite and its interests. So objectivity itself becomes an ideology that serves the interests of the powerful, much like other ideologies that become naturalized as common sense. The claim of objectivity, in a complete reversal and kind of a betrayal of Lippmann's intentions back in the early 20th century, has become a tool used to hide or obfuscate propaganda and pass it off as simply objective fact, as the way things are, rather than one subjective position. That's Pedelty's argument, at least. So he writes, quote, "Ideology is often defined as an explicit socio-political program, propaganda aimed at legitimating a clearly defined system of domination. This definition of ideology is most appropriately applied to totalitarian states such as the former USSR, where both the means of coercion and the rationalizations thereof lay on the surface. The citizens of the USSR consciously recognize the products of Pravda," which is the main state newspaper, constantly recognize the products of Pravda and other state organs as propaganda. Pravda never claimed otherwise. The situation is considerably different in advanced capitalist democracies, especially the US, where the dominant means of communication are rationalized in an obfuscational idiom of neutrality, independence, and objectivity. So the system of domination in the US, as opposed to the Soviet Union, is based not on coercion, not on negative power that prevents people from doing what they want. Instead, in the American context, domination takes the form of positive power, shaping what people want and what they value. Pedelty, following the French philosopher Michel Foucault, talks about this form of power as discipline. The journalists of the Salvadoran Foreign Press Corps Association, so they do face some threats of punishment, of coercive repression, of negative power. But what Pedelty says is much more important as an influence over them in how they report on the country is the way that they're encouraged to follow and rewarded for following professional norms and conventions. This is a form of positive power. They're disciplined into valuing objectivity. And they're into valuing a certain definition of objectivity that, well, in the El Salvador context, basically means not questioning the basic tenets of U.S. geopolitical strategy and not providing a big picture argument that would be unfavorable to U.S. interests. And so because they've kind of internalized this discipline, they don't actually need to be coerced. You don't need to exercise negative power over them if you're the U.S. government or the Salvadoran government, the Salvadoran junta. You don't need to coerce them into reporting in ways that serve your interests because they'll do so on their own in the name of objectivity. Pedelty goes on, quote, "In the North American vernacular, ideology is considered the antithesis of objectivity. The belief in objectivity has itself become an ideology, however, not in the simpler sense of the term, but as a system that both legitimates and obfuscates relations of domination. In claiming to be objective, media organizations shield their close affinity for an incorporation within dominant institutions and ruling class structures. Objectivity asks us to accept the world as it is, or how it has been constructed for us, rather than take a more active role in the creative process of discovery. The ideology of objectivity serves to inhibit imagination." And he's quoting Alan Racklin's book, News as Hegemonic Reality there. "Incorporated into this network of knowledge production, we cede much of our creative social power to those with the greatest means to produce objective truths, quote unquote objective truths, and the greatest interest in maintaining them," meaning, the ruling class. And if some of the vocabulary Pedelty is using here reminds you of my very first lecture about the ruling class and the means of mental production, it's because I think you can really draw a pretty straight line from Marx and Gramsci's work on ruling ideas and on hegemony to Mark Pedelty's critique of objectivity as an ideology. So this is the ugly, kind of colonialist way in which the ritual of performative objectivity can actually encourage groupthink, encourage journalists to ignore alternative and subaltern perspectives and inconvenient facts, and encourage journalists to actually help reinforce and naturalize the dominance of the powerful instead of shedding a critical light on it, which was kind of the original point of substantive objectivity. So to wrap up and recap, I talked about two views, two ways of thinking about objectivity. The first, substantive objectivity, is an ideal that even its advocates, I think, would agree can never be completely or permanently achieved, but it can be thought of as a method, as an ongoing practice of trying to at least question assumptions and interrogate your own subjectivity in order to better appreciate the world in all its complexity and contingency. And also, ideally, substantive objectivity serves to kind of weaken the hold of the culturally powerful over your subjectivity. Right? If we believe the argument that our ideas, our subjectivities are powerfully shaped by the ruling elite. The second way of thinking about objectivity, though, is as a performance that journalists and other knowledge producers put on, basically so that their audiences don't question their claims about the world. And the dangerous side of objectivity as a performance, which really reverses the original intention of substantive objectivity, is that often the most successful and certainly the easiest way to perform objectivity is actually by refusing to take a stand on what's true and false, or by framing stories in ways that don't challenge dominant narratives and assumptions. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks for watching.